is one of the longest lasting civilizations in the entire world and has jumped from dynasty to dynasty. But in the 20th century, China changed drastically, with it going from the 2,000-year-old imperial system to a republic and a communist state under Mao Zedong. China during the early 20th century was rapidly changing into the China we know today. But if you want the full context of how modern China was formed, then check out this video I made on the Chinese Civil War. In short summary, China fell into warlords that evolved into a civil war between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. The communists were small in numbers for most of the war, but through guerrilla war, a Japanese invasion, and poor decisions made by the nationalists, the communists came out on top, with the remaining nationalist forces leaving to Taiwan, where they remain today. But let's imagine an alternate timeline. The communists lose the Chinese Civil War, and China goes into the post-World War II world under the nationalist regime. During the Chinese Civil War, the communists had it pretty bad for the first few years, as the communists were still only in the thousands compared to the nearly million under the nationalists, and in 1934 the communists were about to be annihilated. The communists were surrounded by a massive nationalist force sent by Chiang to destroy the communists. Out of desperation, the communists decided to break through the weakest line and marched 7,767 miles across China, and regroup at a better position. Though 90% of the communists died on the Long March, it was the move that saved the CCP and set their victory into motion. But in this alternate timeline, one thing changes. The communists don't take the Long March, and are surrounded by the nationalists and annihilated. With this single action, the nationalists now oversee a united China. Now the nationalists have to deal with one more enemy, Japan. The Japanese Empire would still invade China with or without the communists, and the poor decisions made during the war with the Japanese are still made. Though with no looming enemy, the nationalists' bad choices don't come to haunt them. With the Second World War over, China goes into the Cold War under the Kuomintang regime. If China never went down the path of Mao, China would remain similar to the previous regimes and dynasties that came before. The CCP and Mao changed China in many ways, but one of the biggest ways was the Cultural Revolution. After the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao still wanted to forge a new China, and so he launched an all-out assault on the traditional Chinese culture, as students were indoctrinated into Maoist revolutionaries told to destroy the remnants of old China. 1 million people died and the old Confucius ideals were strangled by the CCP. Though with no Mao and a very culturally conservative Chiang, the modern culture of China would remain the same as old China. Another way the communists changed China is by isolating the nation until the 70s. China before the meetings with Richard Nixon had been largely isolated from the West as it sought to continue the strategy of communist-only trade and cooperation. This did not go very well as China suffered through the 50s and 60s with food shortages and massive poverty. So when the United States met to talk about connecting China to world trade, China seized the opportunity and became the second major power of the world in the post-Cold War world. Instead, in this timeline, the opening of China would be earlier, but a lot more gradual. Chiang was open about renegotiating the unequal treaties with the West. China doesn't just jump into the West after the Chinese Civil War. Instead, it would remain in a similar position to Francoist Spain. It's not democratic and instead remains sympathetic to the West for the security of its position. So the majority of this early American relationship is mainly defensive against the Soviets. It's not exactly happy, but it's better than an enemy. Despite China joining the world economy, this has both positive and negative effects. As a positive, China would have much more time to industrialize and modernize, but now an unstable dictatorship owns a large part of world trade, so take that as how you will. So China joining the world sphere earlier would modernize China faster, but bring the modern day problems of China on earlier too. This is a pattern of a nationalist China through the 20th century. The modern problems we have with China, like its overbearing territorial claims, absence of democracy, and the use of economic warfare, are just remnants of the issues of the nationalists. China today is very similar to that nationalist China from over 70 years ago. Some things just never changed, and China is a perfect example. Taiwan would solve most of these issues because it didn't have to manage a massive population and piece of land. Maybe China could have democratized after Chiang's death, or it could have remained a one-party dictatorship and the people would just be fine with that. China has always remained authoritarian to keep the state together, and it likely wouldn't be different if the nationalists won the Civil War. But that's boring. China just becomes a non-communist version of modern China. So let's have fun with this scenario, and imagine in this timeline the United States and nationalist China become close to each other, like brothers. So I want to imagine in this alternate timeline, the brothers split and spark into war. After the Chinese Civil War, despite a non-communist victory, America and China are at odds. China wanted to reclaim its influence lost from the century of humiliation, and the barrier of American allies only hindered its progress. China could only regain it through the finishing off of the North Koreans and Vietnamese, with the southern governments under American influence. China continued to become more territorial and aggressive as Chiang feared that his regime was under threat of a Soviet-backed or American-backed coup. So Chiang opted to start a mass propaganda campaign, painting the Soviets and Americans as giants coming to divide up the nation like the European empires of before. War in East Asia was closer than ever, and it would only take something small to set it off. On February 17th, 1969, a recently restored Japanese naval division came up upon a Chinese aircraft carrier near the island of Yokanawa. The Japanese told the Chinese fleet that they were trespassing into Japan's territorial waters, and the Chinese fleet responded that the waters were a part of China, and also the Japanese rearmament was a violation of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed during World War II. Japan threatened China with their American ally, but this wasn't enough as the fleets began to fire on each other. The Battle of Yokanawa was the start of the Brothers' War, with the Republic of China declaring war on Japan. The puppets of China came to the Chinese support, and Japan activated their alliances with the United States and the other Pacific American allies. China mobilized on the South Vietnamese and Korean borders as China launched a full-scale invasion of the other states of East Asia. Seoul and Saigon are steamrolled by the massive Chinese army, with the American troops being sent to Japan and the Philippines. The Chinese build up their forces on the southern coast of Korea and prepare to invade Japan. The American troops have finally arrived in Japan and plan to launch multiple landings in Korea, Shanghai, and Vietnam. The Chinese invasion fleet encountered the Allies' Korean landing force at the gigantic Battle of Jeju. As the Chinese and Allied fleets battled over the South Korean island and clashed in multiple smaller assaults. One of the bloodiest assaults came when the 7th and 18th American Divisions found the 8th Chinese Defense Division at Mount Halasan, with the Battle of the Red Mountain, resulting in 70,000 American losses and 200,000 Chinese losses. The bloody assault gave dominance of the island to the Allies, forcing the Chinese to retreat to the Korean peninsula. The Allies continued to pursue the Chinese by making a landing in Busan. The Allies used their naval dominance in the East China Sea to make their landings throughout the Chinese coast, with the Battle of Shanghai cementing Allied dominance in the East China Sea. The Republic of China began to collapse under the weight of the tide turning against them. The Kuomintang faced a faction of the government which were the remnants of Sun Yat-sen's call for democracy, a newly revitalized communist militia funded by the Soviets, and a revolution in Manchuria led by the former Emperor Puyi, who sought to re-establish the Qing dynasty. China was tearing itself apart from the inside as they were losing a massive war with the West. Chiang became very nervous about his position, and he ordered a final assault to push back the Allied powers. Chiang Kai-shek led his army of over 1 million troops into Korea and encountered the Allies at Seoul. As the Second Battle of Seoul began, the Allies were shocked by the massive army and retreated to the entrances of the city, and held positions in restaurants, government buildings, anything they could hide in. Chiang ordered a tank assault to strike and encircle the northern defenses. 15 tank divisions zoomed towards the defending armies with mines placed before the attack, wiping out 4 divisions. Makeshift speed bumps halted the advance, with rocket launchers from hidden ground positions taking out 2 more divisions. The Japanese aircraft fighters used kamikaze pilots to blow up 4 more divisions. After losing 2/3 of his tank divisions, Chiang ordered a siege strategy for the time being. The Allies built underground tunnels to deliver supplies and men vital to the defense of Seoul. On the final day of the battle, Chiang saw that the siege strategy wasn't going to work, with plots of a coup already forming. Out of desperation, Chiang used his remaining troops and tanks to launch a full-scale assault to overrun the city. Chiang would be no match for the lines upon lines of high-class machine guns, which mowed down Chiang's troops, and Chiang fled the battle with his remaining 50,000 troops and leaving 150,000 troops to be captured. This massive loss by the Nationalists led to a mass push by the Allies, threatening Beijing and Nanking. The Republic of China surrendered to the Allies and collapsed 3 days later. China was occupied by the Allies, which became a republic as the other regions became controlled by royalists and communists. China was bankrupted by the war, and China would remain divided to this very day, as the Warring States period would never truly end. But that's just one timeline.